Good morning. Very happy to be here and continue a long-standing relationship between the U.S. Chamber and this event. I know that within the Chamber, many of my colleagues fight to see who can get invited next because you guys always come to such wonderful places, and as a Californian, I'll take any opportunity I can to get back home. And I hope you appreciate the desert while you're out here. This is the best time to be here in spite of the concert going on. Perfect weather. And they're all gone now, so you guys are here at a good time. I'm going to talk about energy policy. I'm going to try and make it as relevant as possible to what you do as an industry or industries, and give you a little bit of an overview, both operationally and policy-wise, where we are. Because there are many things that are going just profoundly wonderful for this country, and there are probably almost as many things, or equally as many things, that are going profoundly bad for this country. So I'm going to start it off with a little bit of a scene setter just to kind of paint where we are right now. If you look at what the International Energy Agency, so function of the UN, they suggest that energy demand globally is going to increase by over 50% by 2040. And 90% of that, so almost all of it, is coming from developing countries, meaning that the mature economies like the United States, Europe, Japan, are relatively stagnant. All this energy demand is coming from countries with growing economies. And that matters because their priorities are significantly different than mature economies are. Electricity demand expected to almost double, 76%. That's pretty staggering. And they estimate that in order just to meet the same reliability standards we have now, in 2040, it would take an investment of about $1.4 billion globally. Now, in this country, when we invest in electricity infrastructure, it's predominantly investor-owned companies, and they use both capital reserves, but also the rate base in order to make these investments in new generation and so forth. Around the world, most electricity is generated from state-owned enterprises, which means this money has to come from the state. And in developing countries, the states don't always have the kind of reserves, they don't have the capital reserves. And so the metrics there are significantly different also because they're looking for cheap, they're looking for reliable, and they're looking for scale. I'm sorry, 38 billion to do that, trillion. Now, 1.4 billion people around the country don't have access to electricity. And that matters increasingly more and more in the public policy sphere because, again, these developing countries are motivated by different factors. They're motivated by bringing electricity to the masses. There's no other single statistic outside of potable water that is more correlative to quality of life than having access to electricity. And so if you're a developing country and you're sitting down at the table in Paris in December to negotiate the first post-Kyoto Protocol climate agreement, which is right now one of the president's singular initiatives, you are motivated by getting power to your people. You're not necessarily motivated by making sure that power comes from the right, quote-unquote, right source. Meaning that if you are looking to get large amounts of power, say in India or China, you're probably going to turn to coal because it's large, the scale is large, and it's efficient, and it's cheap. And frankly speaking, things like greenhouse gas emissions are going to be a third or fourth consideration for you, which is significantly different than, again, mature economies like the US and Europe, where we're increasingly looking at emissions, and especially greenhouse gas emissions, for the number one priority. And then one other little note that I like to put in there, because while things have been great from a gasoline and diesel perspective as of late, which I'll certainly get into more later, but anytime gasoline prices spike, Congress loves to haul up the CEOs of the 4 or 5 major oil and gas companies and castigate big oil. But remember in the future when this happens that more than 90% of the world's oil supplies are controlled by companies that are owned by countries. So all of these big oil companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, what have you, all of them together control less than 10% of the world's oil. And that matters because they're the ones who are bringing the fuels and the products that we rely on every day, and they have to compete against companies that are owned by countries and can do things because of that. They have concessionary finance rates that make large deals significantly more cost effective, and they can do things from an antitrust perspective that privately held or private companies, investor-owned companies can't do. They can bundle goods. For example, China is really good at this. They have obviously a very energy-thirsty economy, and they're constantly looking, 20 years out and making sure that they have the oil and gas that they need to drive that economic growth that they project to have. So they can go into a place, say Africa, and offer to build a factory, to build whatever parts they're looking to build as a concession in order to gain access to oil in that country. They can provide small arms. They can provide military aircraft, which they have done all of these. Now, as big as Exxon and BP might be, they can't provide tanks, they can't provide fighter aircraft, and they certainly can't provide guns. But that's who they're competing against. Now, here's where all that energy demand is coming from. If you look to the left side of the screen, those are developed countries, in parlance, the OECD countries. Now, from that big pillar in the middle to the right, those are all developing countries. And you see, as I noted before, that there's almost no growth from red to blue in the developing countries. Our economies are essentially mature, and while we hope to eke out an average of maybe 3.5–4% in the United States, that ultimately, just because of efficiency, doesn't translate into energy demand. But if you look at China, whose energy demand doubled between 1990 and 2010, it's expected to double again between now and 2040. Even on the current trajectory, which is certainly a little bit, the economy is a little bit slower than it was, say, 10 years ago. But also countries like India, throughout the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. Again, these countries are motivated by maybe some of the same things that we were motivated by 100 years ago when we moved into the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, not what we're motivated by today in 2015, which is lowering our emissions profile. This is where we in the United States get our energy from. The line down the middle is sort of the baseline. It says 2011, but it really hasn't changed. But this is the most recent year that the government has on record. You'll see that things are moving around a little bit, but really what I want to point out is that in the base year, if you add them all up, fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, and oil account for about 72% of our overall energy demand. Now, if you fast forward to 2040, the government projects that that's going to drop to 69%. Really no change. So even 2040, we are still going to be overly, I won't say overly because that reads into a certain pejorative. We are going to be predominantly dependent upon fossil fuels. We're seeing massive growth in renewables. I mean, for those of you who haven't been in this area before, you go out in the Coachella Valley and you see one of the largest wind farms in the world, and it's been around here for almost 20 years. Those are popping up all throughout the Plain States, Texas, and so forth. But even with the exponential growth that we've seen from wind, and now that we see in solar, it still accounts for a very small fraction of what we as a country depend on. And I make that point only because the scale here is so large. I mean, if you go from 0.5% to 2%, that's a fourfold growth, but it's still only 2% of what we rely on. Just trying to put the whole thing into perspective. Now, we do have, as Barry mentioned, we do have a very, very diverse slate of sources to get our electricity from. And it benefits us. It benefits us as consumers because, one, there's competition, and two, there's reliability. If we have some sort of supply disruption or we have some sort of regulation that affects one type of fuel, we have many others to rely on. The rest of the world doesn't tend to have this. They don't have, primarily because they don't have competition, but they tend to rely on singular or predominantly for one source for their electricity. And you see, while this certainly fluctuates from year to year and it's moving in certain directions, having those big swaths, relatively equal parts, coal, nuclear, gas, and then kind of everything else making up significant amounts, it really, really benefits us as consumers from a reliability standpoint and from a price standpoint. But that is likely to change pretty significantly in the next few years. Now, this is my public service announcement. I use this no matter which audience I'm speaking to. When I spoke in my daughter's third grade class 3 weeks ago, I used it. When I speak in Houston to oil and gas conferences, I use it because this is paramount to public policy changing. It's understanding how much the situation's changed in America. I don't care if you're in my daughter's third grade class and you're 8 or 9, or if you've been teaching civics your entire life, you've probably assumed and have been led to believe that the United States is an energy poor country. I mean, we all, okay, I won't say we all, but many of you remember the Arab oil embargoes, 1973, and some of the impacts that we had there, because for those of us who weren't alive, it's important to remember not only did we rely on oil for gasoline and fuel, but we relied on it for 20% of our electricity. So we got double whammy. We had electricity prices skyrocket, we had gasoline prices skyrocket, and gasoline become scarce. Well, things aren't quite that way anymore. I would argue that a lot of what led to that back 40 plus years ago was at our own choosing, but things are significantly different now. And if you look at the energy resource base we have, it's staggering. If you look at technically recoverable resources, which means the geologists have gone out and they can dig and they can say, look, I found it, it's here, I can taste it, I can touch it. And then their colleagues over in the engineering department can say, well, based on what we have on the shelf, we can pull it out of the ground. The only question is whether or not it's economic at any given time. We have over 100 years of natural gas, almost 200 years of oil, and almost 500 years of coal. Now, if you take it one step further to in-place resources, which is where the geologists have found it, I can taste it, I can touch it, but the engineering hasn't quite caught up yet. Some of the, in the industry, they call it frontier sources of hydrocarbons. We've got almost 600 years of natural gas, 500 years of oil, and almost 10,000 years of coal. We have more energy than anyone else in the world. Our fossil fuel resource base is bigger than every other country. Now you see, it's kind of small, but you see Russia is close, doesn't matter. We still have more energy, a larger energy resource base than any other country. But our policies are still stuck in that mindset of 1973 of energy scarcity. We need to keep these things for a rainy day, and we're not using them as efficiently as we could because there is this assumption across the entire country that we're energy poor, we're gluttons, we need to use it more efficient, we need to use less of it. A lot of that is true, don't get me wrong. You can always use things more efficiently, but you have to go into the conversation understanding what you start with. If you don't know what your hand is, you don't want to play blind poker, and that's what we've been doing for the better part of the last 20 years. Now, you may remember back in 2012 during the presidential debate, there was a pretty pointed exchange between President Obama and Governor Romney over whether or not we were drilling more on federal lands. Because all of this energy revolution that has happened in the last 10 years, which I'll talk more about, has been overwhelmingly on private lands and to a lesser extent state lands, and very little on private lands. Well, that doesn't make the federal government look good. Now, and to be clear here, this is a bipartisan issue. This isn't just President Obama, this isn't just Democrats. I worked in the Bush administration, and we had a less than stellar record on opening federal lands as well, whether it was onshore or offshore. So this is absolutely bipartisan, but the facts speak for themselves. If you look at the number of permits issued to drill on federal lands, they've been consistently in a decline since 2008, 2009. If you look at the total number of acreage we have leased on federal lands, these are lands that you and I own as Americans. Federal government doesn't own them. They're just the stewards of these lands. You and I own them. Both number of leases as well as acres leased down. I mean, this is the government's own statistics. I mean, this isn't, you can spin it any way you want, but the point is that we are allowing less and less access to the resources you and I control. Now, if you go to the offshore, it's even more staggering. We, at this point, have more than 86% of the entire federal offshore is completely off limits to even exploration, to even trying to ascertain how much oil and gas that you and I as Americans own. We haven't been able to go out there for the better part of 30 years. And at this point in time, I mean, we've skipped like 5 or 6 iterations of technology since then, but the way that the companies figure out what's underneath the seabed is they have very state-of-the-art seismic geosymmetry where they can drag these rafts that shoot seismic waves to the maybe two miles to the ocean floor, and then determine with a relatively high degree of certainty what lies beneath, maybe even 3 miles below that. We can't even do that. So we really have no idea what's out there. And to some extent, that's kind of what the many want. Because if we knew how much we had out there, then people wouldn't necessarily stand for this, especially when we reach those periods of in California paying $4.50 per gallon for gasoline. So our policies still stuck 40 years ago. Now, what has changed in the last few years? There's a lot of numbers up here, but I want to just point a few major statistics that are noteworthy. Since 2005, oil production in this country has increased 88%. That is the single largest increase in the history of the world, going from 0 to effectively 4.4 million barrels of oil. Last year it increased 1.2 million barrels throughout the entirety of 2014. That was the largest single year increase that this country has ever experienced. And this wasn't the first year, so you think about the scale by which we were growing. At some point, it's probably going to level off. Well, last year, the most recent year, the largest single year increase that we've ever had. If you look at the amount of oil that we're producing more now than we did in 2005, which is, again, 4.4 million barrels, just that amount of increase is larger than any other country produces, save for Russia and Saudi Arabia. So we added more than Canada produces annually, just in the course of 8 years. That is truly transformative, not only in a geopolitical aspect, but also within this country. And while a lot of people, especially who are close or tied to the oil patch, are very well aware of this, most of the country's not. I mean, everyone's kind of happy that gasoline prices are essentially $1 lower than they were last year. But unless you live in North Dakota or West Texas, South Texas, Pennsylvania, some of the new areas where we've seen this development happen, most of the country is kind of worried about other things. And this has changed the way in which we move energy and the way we use energy, and certainly the amount that we pay for it. Now, it should also be noted that our refineries are running at the highest rate we've ever run before, but juxtapose that with the fact that we're purchasing less gasoline, we're purchasing less diesel, primarily because of more efficient vehicles, but also because we're still kind of in that post-recession territory where we haven't really started to grow. So we're buying less gas, but the refineries are pumping out more. So that means they're selling it to other places. We've become a net exporter of petroleum products for the first time in over 50 years. So the refineries, which are, say, the lion's share of them are centered in the Gulf Coast, in the Houston through New Orleans area, they're taking all this oil we're pulling out of the ground, they're turning it into things like gasoline and jet fuel, and they're shipping it to places like Mexico, like the UK, and they're making money off of it the same way that a widget manufacturer in Michigan makes money off of it when they ship their widget across the pond. So this has the makings, which I'll get into, of something that could be very long-lasting and very transformative. Now, this is part of how that transformation is happening. This is use of natural gas, what the government expects. You'll see that industrial use is the top use for natural gas in this country, while electric generation is pretty close to that. I want to focus on the industrial side for a bit because that is really what is transforming in ways that people never could have projected, even 10 years ago. We are on the verge of becoming a manufacturing juggernaut. I mean, if you go back 10 years ago, let's call it 2004, as a country, we collectively washed our hands of manufacturing. I mean, certainly there were exceptions to that, but as a country, we said, all right, that was a vestige of post-World War II. We can't compete with cheap labor anymore. We have the most expensive natural gas in the entire world. We're just going to become a service sector and a technology economy. We have to learn how to live with that and transition. Well, you fast forward now, we have the cheapest natural gas in the world, or almost, and we have relatively competitive labor rates because the rest of the world, as it's become more technologically savvy, it's had to pay their workers more. So all of a sudden, this is a place for manufacturing investment. And it's starting in the petrochemical sector, and the refining sector, the manufacturers that rely on natural gas and oil more than any other single sector. But you see, we did a study of what the overall macroeconomic impacts would be of this energy revolution. And certainly you see them in communities where they drill for oil. I mean, that's pretty transparent. When you drive through West Texas, you see oil derricks as far as the eye can see. But the part that's not quite so obvious is that downstream, that the consumers of those products. And what we're seeing is projections for increases in manufacturing, everything from iron, steel, plastics, rubber, agricultural fertilizers, and even machinery. But this is all starting with this massive resource base of oil and gas at a cheap and reliable entry point. And here's really what makes this all happen. This is my favorite slide. If you take something like ethylene or polyethylene, but ethylene is the cornerstone of US or manufacturing around the world. I mean, there are many different synthetic products, but ethylene is the largest. And if you go into Walmart, I would wager that probably 80% of all the products on the shelf there have some form of ethylene or derivative of ethylene or other polyolefins in it. What this chart shows you is how much it costs to produce a ton of ethylene in this country versus the rest of the world. The first one there on the left, that's the Middle East. Let's not really take them into account right now because their energy price is even cheaper than ours, but they don't really have they have a growing, but they have a relatively small industry as far as producing these types of products. But if you look at Canada and the US, it costs, and this obviously changes as commodities change, but it costs us roughly $300 to produce a ton of this. Now you go to the rest of the world, in Asia or Europe, it costs them over $900 a ton. The single largest input cost for the petrochemical industry costs a third here of what it does around the world. And that's because we have ethane in the ground. We can derive ethane from the natural gas that we're producing. Many of the other countries where this manufacturing sector exists have no access to this whatsoever. And they have to derive the same molecules by refining crude oil. And in spite of where we are right this second with this major downturn in the price of oil, deriving those molecules from oil versus natural gas on an apples-to-apples basis, it's roughly 2/3 more expensive. Point is that we have a major advantage here because of this energy, and we're starting to see the investment come because of that. One of the other aspects, number one, is the feedstock. So in this case, ethane, but the second largest input cost for these types of manufacturers is electricity. And what this chart shows you, and I'm happy to make any of these available, so don't strain too hard to see the screen there. I know some of these shapes are small, but what this is showing is comparing our electricity costs between us and our 5 largest trading partners between 2000 and 2014. So each country has a different color. The triangle is where we were in 2000, and the square is where we were in 2014. And what you see over that time frame is every single one of these countries, we've become more competitive to the point where at this rate now, Canada is the only other trading partner that's on par with our electricity rate. You see places like Japan and Germany, it's more than double what it is here. So again, our manufacturers are competing against communities who want to host these facilities around the world, but it costs them triple for the ethane costs or the chemical or the gas feedstock, and in some cases it costs them double for the electricity. All of a sudden, all the things that made the US a place that we wanted to get rid of manufacturing, or we couldn't compete, we were outsourcing and offshoring everything, all of that has been turned on its head now, and we're seeing investment come back in. We estimate that in this study, between now and 2020, we're going to see somewhere in the neighborhood of about $130 billion invested in this sector. We've already seen north of $25 billion of that come in, building things like ethane crackers and gas fractionation plants. And I'll be honest, most of this is happening in the Gulf Coast because that's where this infrastructure is. But it's creating new demands throughout the country. It's creating demands for the products that we're pulling out of the ground in North Dakota or in California or in Ohio that we wouldn't otherwise have. And this matters because in this country, we don't allow their producers to export their oil and to a large extent, their natural gas. When you add it all up, the upstream, the guys and gals out there on the rigs pulling the stuff out of the ground, the midstream, the build out of the new pipes and trains, because it's important to realize that, all of a sudden, North Dakota is the second largest oil producer in the country. 10 years ago, barely existed as an oil producer, which is to say that the infrastructure didn't exist to bring this massive amount of crude to where people live, because last I checked, there really aren't that many people in Bismarck. As beautiful as it is, it needs to come down to the Gulf Coast where all this refining and petrochemical sector is. And so we had to build out a lot of pipe, a lot of train, a lot of barge. And then ultimately, that downstream, that build out of those petrochemical facilities, those refiners, and then the final domino in this series of dominoes falling is the traditional manufacturers, the manufacturers that many of you are, and that you and I might think about, again, hearkening back to my reference to the Acme Inc. up in Michigan who manufactures widgets. Those people, those companies buy the products that these petrochemical manufacturers make. It's the input cost for their whatever it is, whether it's a clicker that changes my slides, or whether it's 80% of what you might have in a brand new Chevy Impala. They're buying these products as their feedstocks. They're buying them from people now who have cheaper input costs than their competitors around the world. They're still selling the products at the same price. But now, because their margins are so larger, in order to gain market share, they can undercut the price. They can undercut the price that the traditional manufacturers are going to have to pay for it. We're already starting to see a little bit of that. But once we see that entire $120, $140 billion investment and all the stuff flowing out of the back end of those facilities, traditional manufacturers here benefit quite a bit. But anyway, you add it all up, put it in a box, shake it up. What we found is that roughly in 2013, 2.1 million people were employed solely because of this unconventional revolution. Not the traditional oil and gas stuff, just what has come online over the last 5 to 10 years. And you fast forward to 2025, we estimate that's going to double, nearly double, to 3.9 million people. Now, this was the only sector, and I'm sure many of you are well aware of this, that was creating jobs during the Great Recession. While we were negotiating, north of 9, almost 10% unemployment rates, this industry was creating 2.1 million jobs, because almost all these jobs happened in the previous 5 years. And then you add it all together, as far as government revenue, most states are still in an era of fiscal crisis, shall we say, and certainly the federal government is, this fiscal austerity. What we find is that between 2012 and 2025, just the unconventional oil and gas industry produced north of $1.6 trillion in government revenue. Now that is split roughly equally between federal and then the rest of the country. But even at DC, $1.6 trillion is a lot of money. And nobody was planning on this. Even go back 5 years ago, Governor Perry in Texas, he wasn't planning on this massive influx of government revenue that found its way to Austin to fund the things that we depend on our states to fund, things like education, things like roads and infrastructure, first responders. This was the equivalent of you and I going to do our laundry on a Sunday and finding a $5 bill. Well, I mean, in Columbus, Ohio, they found a $20 billion bill because, again, they were not expecting that even 2 years before that. It wasn't in the budget. Now, it's not just economics that have been where we've benefited. Energy security has, let's just put it this way, we are more energy secure now than we have been in the better part of 30 years, and this is why. What this chart shows you is where we get oil from. So you start at the bottom, the two blues, that's domestically produced oil. It doesn't really matter, the tight oil, conventional oil, we don't need to get that far in the weeds. But the bottom line is you see domestically produced oil is increasing significantly. Then you move into the green and the orange. That's Canadian imports. Now, I'd rather every barrel of oil we use come from the United States, but if it has to come from somewhere else, it might as well be Canada, because they're our #1 trading partner. Obviously, you've got a 99.99999% overlap as far as foreign policy. And truth be told, they produce a type of oil in Alberta that we don't produce here, at least not enough. If you go up maybe 100 miles north of here in Kern County in the Bakersfield area, we produce some of this. This is the heavy, what we call sour oil. What we produce for the most part in this country is the light sweet crude. It's sort of the Dom Perignon of oil because it's the purest and it's the easiest to refine. Now this heavy sour stuff, that's kind of like the Budweiser. That's the hearty stuff. It's a lot cheaper too. And that matters because our engineers have designed our refineries to be able to produce the gasoline and the jet fuel that the world buys by refining that heavy stuff, the Budweiser stuff, the cheaper stuff. So obviously, if your input costs are cheaper, your margins are bigger. Now, the rest of the world's not as advanced when it comes to refining. Obviously, there's a few exceptions here and there, but as an entire country, nobody can compete as far as the engineering prowesses of our refining industry. So we have these refineries built to rely on this heavy stuff, but then all of a sudden, we've got an 88% increase in the light stuff. And you see there's kind of a dislocation there. Well, getting that stuff, the heavy stuff from Canada, is helping our refineries. The problem is, and I'll get into this a little bit later, is that our producers can't in turn take the light stuff that they have a lot of now and sell it anywhere else in the world because we have another policy that's a vestige of 1973 that prevents us from exporting the stuff. But the point is Canadian imports increasing, domestic production increasing, overall demand roughly stable. So what you see is that nasty gray area, it's getting shrunk out. Other imports, that's overseas imports. At this point, 2 years ago, we were importing roughly 1 million barrels from Nigeria. Now, I have nothing against any Nigerians, but it's a very unstable country. It's a very unstable country to produce oil and gas in. So it's not exactly reliable. Today, 0 barrels. It's all because of what's happening in Texas and North Dakota and around the country. Now, that's just one example, but we're pushing out so much of that overseas import. You go back to that same year, 2005, when we started this thing, we were importing roughly 2/3 of all the oil we used. 2/3, 2 out of every 3 barrels we use, being imported. Today, it's down to about 40%, and it's dropping pretty quickly. So energy security has improved significantly also. But we'll get to the economics in a second. This isn't a sure thing. This is a map that some of my friends, I use the term friends lightly, at an organization called Food and Water Watch International, which coined the term fractivists, that they post on their website proudly. That to date, 453 actions have been taken across the country to stop fracking. Now, I will acknowledge that most of these actions are non-binding, or they've happened in places where it doesn't matter. 2011, the state of Vermont passed a fracking ban. Well, there's no oil in Vermont, so I'm not sure that that really matters. But these fractivists have gotten smarter and better at what they do, to the point where 120 miles from here, Los Angeles. Now, as a Californian, I know how most of the rest of the country views Los Angeles. You know, it's a bunch of Hollywood people and surfer dudes. But I will tell you that up until this happened, the Los Angeles basin was one of the most active oil and gas basins in the country, actively drilling for new oil and producing oil. Now, it's hidden. You can't see it unless you know where to look. It's not like when you go on the plains of West Texas and you just can't avoid seeing it. It's hidden. But it was there. And then in May, the Los Angeles City Council passed a fracking ban. So it went from major active oil and gas basin to nothing. Now, up until a political deal was cut last October, the state of Colorado was considering there was going to be an initiative on the ballot there that would have banned fracking. It would have ended oil and gas in Colorado. That counts for roughly $30 billion to Colorado's economy, about 10% of its GDP, about 10% of its unemployment. And these same people were able to convince enough people there that, hey, we should get rid of this, at least enough to get it on the ballot. Now, I'm convinced it would have been defeated at the ballot had it made it to the election. But the point is that they're making inroads all over the place. Denton, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, literally a stone's throw from where this entire revolution happened in North Texas. They passed a ban there. In Texas, a ban on fracking. Again, they're getting smarter, they're getting better. And yeah, they may be cherry-picking communities where there's a university or they have some anomaly that makes it easier to get these things passed, but the point is they're taking a foothold. And that's because, I'll be honest, the industry hasn't necessarily always been its best advocate. Part of it is just not explaining to the community what's going on. You know, you can't just drop into Western Pennsylvania who has no idea what oil and gas development is and expect that community to have the same understanding as the folks out in Midland and Odessa. I mean, we need to get in there and explain to them what they're doing, because if we don't explain it to them, the other side is going to fill their head with all kinds of bad stuff, and most of it's not going to be accurate. Now, the economics or the operational part of it. World oil demand is roughly about 91 92 million barrels of oil a day. Now, I, the president, and everyone else who deals in oil and gas policy, 4 or 5, even 3 years ago, we said, you know what? The U.S. could never produce enough to impact the price of oil because it's a global commodity. We could never impact a 91 million barrel a day supply and demand balance. We were all wrong. And from a consumer standpoint, we were wrong for, gladly, because it meant all of a sudden, it finally hit the global market circa July, where production was outstripping demand. At this point, it was estimated about a month ago that we're producing about 1.5 million barrels globally more than we're consuming. That means there's a glut. More supply than there is demand, which means prices go down, and prices went down significantly. Now, it's $1 million, billion, God, it's $1 trillion question when they're going to level off, when they're going to come back up. But the point is that this has all happened for many different reasons, but it's happened because of what has happened in the U.S. more than any other single reason. Nobody predicted that, and it's come online in such a big way that it completely altered the supply and demand fundamentals around the globe. What does that mean? What has that meant as far as operations? Well, we've laid down more than 50% of the rigs we had running back in October. Over 800 rigs. Each one of these rigs, has anywhere from 20 to 50 people, shift work over and over, plus probably 4 to 5 times that, as far as support people who operate the rig or who support the rig, move the rig, support the workers on the rig. And so this has been a major hardship in the oil patch. Any of you from Texas or any of these other states have been mentioning, you know this firsthand. I will say that it's not been as bad, the layoffs have not been as bad as what most anticipated, and that owes to the fact that the industry has spent the better part of the last 5 years doing everything they can to hire enough people to support what they were doing, and it was very, very tough. And so now the last thing they want to do is lay everyone off and have to go through this again 1.5 years from now. Now, it's been a double whammy. Not only has the price of oil dropped, the price of gas has dropped too. So we've lost almost 40% of all of our gas rigs. And there's a pretty significant lag. And that's what the $1 trillion question is. In this graph, the blue line is U.S. production. You see that it's continuing to go up. Up, up, up. Marginally, but up. The red line is the oil rig count. And you see it basically just fell off a cliff back in November. Now, when is the red going to translate into blue? Historically, it's normally 6 to 9 months. When you start seeing rigs lay down, it takes 6 to 9 months until you see production level off. There was some guesstimation that this time would be even faster, because you have to realize that bringing a rig out and starting to drill today doesn't really bring a barrel of oil to the market for 6 to 9 months. That's how long it takes to drill, complete, and hook that well up to some sort of takeaway system. Well, it's been 6 months, and we're not really seeing anything yet. Not only that, but we know that the industry itself has over 1,000 wells that have been drilled but haven't been hooked up yet. So there's this massive amount of inventory out there in the ground, just ready to go when prices tick up again. And that somewhat scares me as an oil and gas guy, that as soon as prices tick up, everyone starts hooking up their wells, and that pushes prices back down again, and we go through this all over again. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty because we've never been here before. We've never relied on these types of wells. As many of you have probably heard, these wells produce massive amounts early on, but then they also drop off really quick. They produce about 50% of all the oil in the first year. They keep producing after that, but at a much lower rate than the conventional. So no one's really sure when this is all going to happen. And obviously you can never predict world events too. Maybe Iraq falls off the face of the earth. Maybe Libya moves into another civil war. All kinds of things out there. But from just a pure production standpoint, we have produced ourselves into a great spot for America, but a really bad spot for the oil and gas community. And within the chamber, it's tough for me because this is a boon for the economy. I mean, the Department of Energy has forecast that we're going to be spending more than $1 less on gasoline this summer than we did last year. And that translates in turn to about $800 per family across an entire year. That's the best stimulus you could ever hope for. And so for a net benefit for America, it's great. But if you live in Houston, or you live in Odessa, you live in Bismarck, I feel your pain. Now, as I mentioned, the one thing we can do right now to kind of alleviate some of that pain is to revisit this 40-year-old ban on exports. Right now, I haven't checked the market this morning, but right now, on Friday, West Texas Intermediate, which is the US benchmark, was trading for, we'll call it $50 a barrel. And then Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, was trading at roughly $57 a barrel. That's a $7 spread. That's $7 that someone who produces a barrel of oil in Texas or North Dakota can't get, because they can't go to Asia, they can't go to Europe and market that same barrel of oil. Now, that $7 spread may make the difference between whether or not it makes sense to drill that well or not. And it's an artificial barrier. It's an artificial barrier that dates back to 1975 as a reaction to the Arab oil embargo, and said, look, we don't want to get ourselves in that position again. We don't want to be that vulnerable, so we're not going to export anything. Well, as I've mentioned, things have changed dramatically. We have more oil than we've ever anticipated. We have more than enough to this point that many refineries are turning US producers away because they're plumb full. Point is that this is the one thing that can bring some relief to the producing community. But it takes time, because people in Congress, they don't want to get out ahead of the public on this. They don't want to be the one who votes for this, and then as soon as gasoline, if something happens in the Mideast, gasoline prices rocket up $1 a gallon, and then people are out there with their pitchforks and their torches, and they point and say, it's her fault. She voted for exports, and that's why prices are up. Well, the two are completely unrelated, but that's the potency and of the populism that centers around US energy policy. Now, I want to shift and spend the rest of the time doing a little bit of the bad side of things. I mean, obviously there's some bad side on the oil patch, but things have been going really, really well as far as oil and gas production, transforming this country. Now let's look at the electricity side, because things there are going in the opposite direction. This is a visual depiction that I like to put up there, not so that you can necessarily read it, because again, I know you can't read from where you are, but to show you all the different major regulations and rules that the EPA is either in the middle of doing or will be doing, has announced it will be doing between now and 2016. This is important because if you're a utility and you see demand growth growing in your region, and you figure out, you know what, we need to build some new generation in order to meet that demand, you got to thread this needle. You want to go out and build a brand new gas plant, might cost you upwards of $1.5 billion, $2 billion. And the last thing in the world you want is for that to be a sunk cost 3 years from now, because some regulation gets put in place that makes the entire thing useless. So you got to try and thread this needle, which makes it really tough, which is one of the reasons why you're not seeing these major investments right now. I will tell you, though, is that because of regulation that came into place last year, we are no longer legally able to build a single coal plant in this country. Go back to one of my public education one, my service announcement, 10,000 years of coal, but we've committed to never building another coal plant again. Maybe a little bit of a dislocation there, but we'll talk about that too. There's a big narrative in DC and around some places around the country, even from the oil patch to some extent, that this isn't really, coal's getting its butt kicked, but it's getting its butt kicked fair and square. It's losing on economics. We got so much natural gas, the market's glutted, prices plummeted, and it's pushing coal out of the generation market because utilities can buy gas cheaper. Well, I'm not going to say there's not some truth to that, because natural gas prices went from roughly $12 a unit to now we're trading at about $2.50. So that's a big drop off in a relatively short period of time. And again, as consumers, we've benefited tremendously. But what this graph shows us is that at no point in time, zero, never, has natural gas ever been cheaper than coal on a unit-to-unit basis. Now, I love natural gas, but I just want to make sure that we understand that there's been downward price pressure, but it's not beating coal. What is beating coal is this. And what this is going to be, which I'll talk about in a second, it's not just about coal, it's about gas too. It's just that coal is the first step. What ultimately we're seeing right now is a regulation that went into place this year to control mercury emissions is going to knock off roughly about 60 gigawatts of coal. You may not know a gigawatt from a gigabyte. Don't need to know that. What this ultimately translates to is about 10% of our entire generation fleet across the country going bye-bye. That's a lot. For a country this big, 10%, that's one regulation. Now, let's talk a little bit about clean air. Mercury, for example. The Clean Air Act was passed roughly 40 years ago because, frankly speaking, we had some really, really crappy air. I mean, if you would have gone over to the LA Basin, maybe you saw the tops of the mountains once every 10 days. In the subsequent 40 years, the Clean Air Act has been arguably, at least by me, the most unmitigated success that this country could ever point to. And I'll be honest, industry, we fought it back then, but we've all benefited from it. Mercury is a great example. In the 40 years since we passed this, we've eliminated 95% of all the mercury that comes out of power plants, down to that final 5%. And as any engineer will tell you, getting that final 5% is kind of like bleeding a rock. I mean, it's exponentially more difficult than removing that final 5%. And the way the Clean Air Act is supposed to work is you have this gradual, predictable phase out so that utilities and the engineers can constantly be working out the next time it ratchets down. So it's smooth and it's predictable. Well, what this administration decided to do is, well, hey, look, man, we don't have a whole lot of time left. Let's just get rid of the final 5%, even though there was supposed to be another 10 or 15 years for the industry to do it. Well, the industry wasn't ready, and that's why we see this major dislocation. You're not supposed to lose 10% of your entire generation overnight, and that's what we've done just with this one rule. But this is just one rule. These are where those plants are located. You see that the industrial Midwest gets crushed the hardest. We've already seen 1 year out auction for power prices more than double. So if you live in this part of the world, you're going to see prices go up if you haven't already. Also in the Southeast, same thing. Now remember what I was saying, that electricity was the second biggest feed or input to those manufacturers that were starting this manufacturing rebirth? Well, this is headwind. I mean, things looked great 2 years ago, but now all of a sudden we have all these plants closing down, prices going up. Maybe the investment in the US isn't looking so good anymore compared to pick another country in the world. But again, that was one regulation. The one that's been getting all the attention is the greenhouse gas regulations. We've proposed a rule that said we can't build any more coal plants, and that a modern natural gas plant is the standard. Problem is that gets ratcheted down every 5 years, which means that a gas plant built today, by definition, can't be built 5 years from now. So this isn't just about coal, this is absolutely about natural gas. What the Clean Air Act does, very predictably, can't tell how many years this is going to take, but it systematically eliminates whatever the pollutant it's going after, in this case, greenhouse gases. So what I can tell you with almost 100% surety is that if this law remains, or if this process remains as it is, at some point in the future of some people in this room who will still be alive, we will no longer be able to use coal or natural gas to generate electricity. The only exception is if there's a transformative technological revolution. And I'm never going to bet against US engineering because they've conquered the world, but by the same token, I don't know that we want to bet the entire US economy on it. Now, this is one of the reasons why the Clean Air Act has worked so well. It's predictable. EPA issues a standard. Now, EPA can't enforce that standard. The way the Clean Air Act works is the states have to do that. So the states get the standard, they put together a plan and say, all right, Washington, here's how we're going to meet the standard you just set. Washington says, okay, go get them. Or, well, maybe you need to tinker with this. Either way, now here's your plan. And then they go out and they start regulating power plants. In this example, coal plant. Very predictable. We've done this dozens and dozens of times. Well, this is what the greenhouse gas regulation looks like. And it's meant to be their tongue-in-cheek, but this is real. I mean, I didn't invent any of this. These are all the different steps that are now a part of this process. And not a single state, no matter how much it loves this rule or the principle of this rule, places like New York and my home state of California, they have all complained about this because they have no idea what this means. And they're not going to know what it means until 10 years after it started being implemented. It's very confusing. And I'm going to end this with something that's even bigger than just electricity, and that's ozone. While the greenhouse gas regulation is this big shiny lure up here that everyone in this part of the economy is focused on, this ozone rule is kind of just sneaking in the back door. And it's important because ozone is one of those other criteria air pollutants that the EPA has to go after. The most recent standard was set roughly, and it just finalized about 5 years ago. And it was absolutely, for the state implementation plans, the final one just went into effect about 2 months ago. So we're just had a new standard, and everyone's starting to realize, okay, here's what we have to do to comply with this. Well, these guys, this administration, again, looked at their watch and said, man, we only got 2 years left. We really want to just nip this one in the bud. So they proposed a new standard. And what this standard would do is put 2/3 of the country, every single one of these colors up there, is a county that would be in non-attainment. Non-attainment matters a lot because what non-attainment means, two things. It means one, the EPA can withhold highway funding from you. We all pay gas taxes, federal gas taxes. Every time we fill our car or rig up, a certain percentage of that goes to DC to fund surface transportation across the entire country. If you're in non-attainment for any one of the criteria air pollutants, especially ozone, they can start withholding money from you. And that matters a boatload to local counties and municipalities that depend on this money, money that their citizens are paying in order to build the new roads and bridges and whatnot. The other reason why it matters is because you need to get Clean Air Act permits for certain big facilities. Let's say you want to expand a refinery or you want to build a new manufacturing facility. You got to go to your state EPA and get a Clean Air Act permit. When you're in non-attainment and you can't get that permit unless somehow throughout the county you eliminate 1.5 times the amount of ozone that you're proposing to emit. So let's say that you want to build a new factory and you're going to emit 100 tons of ozone a year. Before you can get that permit, 150 tons of ozone need to be eliminated from existing sources. That, by definition, is a zero-sum game. In fact, it's actually a negative game, which is great for if you're trying to eliminate the pollutant, but in this case, you're also eliminating economic growth. So again, major headwind. All those wonderful things I talked about, manufacturing renaissance and the wonders it's bringing to this country, this is a headwind blowing at it. If you're, some multinational conglomerate who wants to take advantage of all the great things in the U.S., cheap fuel, cheap feedstocks, cheap electricity, and predictability and regulation, all of a sudden, this is all happening in the span of about 2 years. These people are starting to get weak-kneed. I mean, they're getting a little jittery. Maybe this isn't the place to invest. It may cost a lot more in Germany, but at least we know it's not going to change over there. And ultimately, it looks like the U.S. is maybe just as expensive as Germany is. So overall, here's some of the statistics on the ozone rule. Some of my colleagues at the National Association of Manufacturers ran the numbers, and they found out that this would be the most expensive regulation in the history of this country. One regulation, ozone. I'm guessing 90% of you probably never even heard of it, but the most expensive regulation ever. More expensive than the Affordable Care Act, more expensive than Dodd-Frank. In fact, it's so expensive, it's more expensive than all of the Obama administration's regulations combined. And it's just kind of flying in the back door. So you hear a lot more about it, but it's important that local elected officials understand that they're going to get hammered, and economies are going to get hammered. And the only way people move is if you rattle their chains and say, look, we're not directly involved in transportation, but we're ancillary parts of that. And if that goes away, if we lose 20% of our transportation funding, that's going to hurt my bottom line. That's going to hurt the dozens or hundreds of employees that we have. They need to hear that kind of information because that's what moves local officials. If local officials move, they tell the White House, hey guys, look, maybe they like what they've been doing. We like what you guys did on climate, and we like what you're doing on Clean Air Act, but this one, man, this one's way over the top. It's a bridge too far. Because if it doesn't, by October they finalize this, we're going to see whether or not these projections, most expensive regulation in history, are accurate. And I don't think that's a test that any of us want to take. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come chat with you today. I think we probably have a few minutes for questions, Barry. I know I dropped a lot of hopefully useful information on you. Maybe there's a question or two. If not, that's fine.
We'll find some questions.
Yeah, exactly. I'm for it. That was a joke. Okay, so as Barry mentioned, I worked in the nuclear energy office at DOE during the Bush administration. You may remember back in 2006, there was a lot of talk about nuclear renaissance. I mean, there were plans for maybe upwards of 20 different plants being built in the relatively near future. Well, fast forward to 2015, and it hasn't been quite as successful as we anticipated. Right now, there's 5 new plants being built, which in and of itself is tremendous because we haven't started a new plant, turned it on in over 30 years. So that's good. The problem is natural gas. This is the one situation where the economic argument is 100% accurate. Unlike with coal, which is don't look at the regulations, it's really natural gas is pushing out. In this case, natural gas did push nuclear out. It's very difficult for any utility of any size to bet upwards of $10 billion in a new plant when natural gas is this low. I mean, investors just look at it and say, are you kidding me? I mean, a $10 billion investment might very well take up half of its balance sheet. And as one nuclear CEO put it, it's like, it's all risk, no reward. I'm the one putting my job on the line, undertaking this investment, and I know it's going to be a benefit for the next 80 years. The problem is I'm not going to see any of that benefit. I'm going to be long gone, and all my successors are going to get it. And I'm going to get ran out of town in the meantime. So right now, new investment in nuclear is at a minimum. There's a lot of good things happening around Harry Reid's retirement as far as managing the waste. But I'm not very bullish on a significant amount of nuclear coming online anytime in the next 20 years.
We have a question here in the back left.
First of all, you have a great presentation. I'm from Oklahoma, and in Cushing, there's, of course, a lot of storage. And my friends
Well, there was. I don't know if there is anymore.
It's almost full. Is that the way it is in other storage facilities around the country? And what impact do you see that having?
Absolutely. When I speak to oil and gas crowds, I speak more to that, but that kind of gets into the weeds, so I didn't want to drop so much in the weed stuff on you guys. But yeah, I mean, Cushing, Oklahoma is the central clearinghouse around the country for crude oil, and meaning that if you buy a future, that's where you have to deliver it. Right now, it's getting very, very close to busting at the seams, and that's because the producers, as you saw, our production's still going up, but our demand isn't going up. So it has to go somewhere. They can't sell it, can't export it, it has to get stored. Cushing's almost full. Yes, it's happening also in the Gulf Coast. And we're seeing large traders, both companies as well as speculators, who are big enough, they're actually leasing gigantic ships to store it for maybe a year. Because right now there's what they call a contango play, where you can buy it now and then at the same time sell a future for it, a year out future, and make an instant profit. The only problem is you still have to deliver it a year later, and you have to find somewhere to store it in the meantime. So if you're making a $1 billion investment, you might be able to go out and rent a tanker. I think most people in the industry expect that storage is going to decline a little bit. One of the reasons it's built so much is that refineries, because of the Clean Air Act, we have basically 2 different blends of gasoline, no matter where you live. In California, there's like 60 blends, but that's a different story. You have winter blend, and then you have summer blend. It's warmer, you get more volatile organic compounds in the air that lead to smog. They got to change the blend. So what they've been doing over the last 2 months is retooling the refineries to switch to summer blend, which means they're not running as much. They're going to start running again. Theoretically, that's going to bleed off some of the storage. But if we hit like whatever it is, maximum storage, then we will see the price of oil do a nosedive, which is great for consumers, horrible for the producers. Sir?
Thank you. That was a very informative presentation. I had a question. About 4 or 5 years ago, we saw a spike in geothermal energy. Somehow, over a couple of years, it died down or went down. Do you see that coming back?
Well, I mean, like most renewables, geothermal is somewhat limited by scope. It's predominantly focused in the West, where it's geologically warmer at lower drill depths, but there's only so much of it you can do. There's only so many people that live in Idaho and Nevada, and once you hit whatever your critical mass is, you can't really grow it. It's kind of like hydroelectric. I mean, hydroelectric, for most people, is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I mean, it's an ever replenishable, I shouldn't say that because in California, water doesn't seem to be very replenishable anymore, but it's an ever replenishable source of energy, but there's only so many rivers that you can dam up and benefit from. You're starting to see a little bit of it happen in the east, but it has a glass ceiling just because there's not that many places where you can efficiently drill and get to the depth that's necessary to actually heat the water enough to generate electricity. So it plays a crucial part, some places more crucial than others, but it's got a glass ceiling.
Question here.
Nice presentation.
Thank you.
I was surprised to see 4% of our power being generated by wind, and curious what the long-term what the production tax credit, the PTC, holds for wind energy.
So, as most of you probably know, wind and solar power are directly subsidized through a production or investment tax credit, which means every megawatt of electricity that is put onto the grid, whoever owns that credit generates, I think it's 4 cents a kilowatt hour. But we have a very sordid history of letting it lapse. I mean, it's lapsed, I think, 10 times now since it was first put in place in 1990. In fact, it lapsed again at the end of last year. In fact, not only did it lapse, but Congress passed it retroactively for the year at the end of December. So in December, after Christmas, they say, okay, guess what? On December 26th of 2014, you guys get this credit for all of 2014. Well, it doesn't really do you much good when 95% of the year is over. So where we are right now is it's lapsed. And what we've seen is investment continues to drop every time it lapses. There's a big fight, but the benefit, I guess, for wind is that it's one of many credits, things like the research and development tax credit. I mean, that's one that almost all of business supports. And there's like 40 of those tax credits that get put into this whole pool of tax credits. And while there's a lot of people who want to see the production tax credit go away, they don't necessarily want to see the other credits go away. So it ends up being sort of one of those sausage-making processes where somehow magically, even though there's critical mass to stop it, it keeps squirting through. I think it's clear, though, the wind industry has realized that its days are numbered, the credits' days are numbered, and we've got to find a way to predictably get rid of it. And so that's kind of where the wind industry is right now. Let's pass it one final time for a specified time frame, 2, 3, 4 years, and then it's gone for good. Is that going to happen? I don't know, because this really doesn't get discussed until that final month at the end of the year when our legislators are forced to do it. But right now, it really hurts the industry because it's always start and stop, start and stop, start and stop.
What happens to all the windmills out here in the
Well, once they've gotten built, they have a specific time frame where they can continue to benefit from that credit. And once that time frame is gone, it's gone. What we're talking about is credits for new builds. And see, what Congress did, it used to be in order to get the credit, you had to have it up and running by the end of the year or whatever year it expired. But 2 years ago, during the fiscal cliff debate, they changed the terms and said, you don't have to have it up and running, you just have to essentially have turned dirt. So you don't have to invest everything. You only have to invest, ultimately Treasury said like 5%. 5% preserves the credit for you. So you may not build it for 2 more years, but you've preserved that credit. So, but that time frame has lapsed now too. So right now, it's difficult to see a bright future without that credit. Even with these greenhouse gas rules and the EPA pushing states to, excuse me, rely more and more on renewables, right now, excuse me, right now, it's just not economic without that credit.
Another question. One right here. Tony?
Excellent presentation. Question. There's a week ago, I saw where they had a listing of all the oil and gas companies, and I think it was last week, there was a merger. And it seems like they're saying that could be a trend, especially now in the next few years. How would that affect natural gas prices if we all of a sudden have full monopoly?
Well, I mean, I don't think you could ever see a real monopoly because you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of producers. Now, Shell and BG coming together certainly give it a larger market share than it did, but really the part that regulators around the world are concerned with on that case is not so much the production of natural gas, but it's the transport overseas, liquefied natural gas. Unlike oil, where you can just stick it on a ship and ship it, in order to move gas, you have to super freeze it and put it on special ships, ship it to a place that has a regasifier. It's very expensive. But if you're Japan and you don't have any natural resources to speak of, you're overly reliant on it. China uses a lot of it. Lots of Asia uses a lot of it. They're concerned that potentially the consolidation and the market share by this joint company might give it pricing power. Because of our massive resource base, we're immune from that. I mean, we don't have to worry about this company importing gas here. They're going to be importing gas from here. So in that one instance, I don't think there's an issue. If there's going to be more consolidation, I don't know. I mean, all these companies are my members, and obviously they don't share anything with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to trade on it anyway. But I think right now, with the dollar being as strong as it is, you have to imagine that U.S. companies are going to take advantage of that. I mean, if you look at the exchange rate for this one deal, buying a U.S. company in U.S. dollars from a London-based company, the exchange rate from U.S. dollars to pound sterling is the lowest it's been in, I think, 10 years. So, I mean, they were able to shave off roughly, I don't know, maybe 5–10% of what the cost would be just because of the exchange rate. So that's good for the industry because they can reduce double costs, and they can lower the price in which they operate, which right now every single one of these companies needs to do in order to maintain some amount of profitability. From a consumer standpoint, because this is a global market, even natural gas, I don't think it affects us really at all.
Hi, this is Malay, again, Usha Martin Americas, from Houston. Is there a vision to see citizens developing their own power by solar cells on the rooftop and a microturbine in the backyard?
That's $1 million question. It's because of technology, having decentralized power, distributed generation, and it's causing a lot of friction throughout the southern tier of the country, places like Arizona, Georgia, California. Because here's the deal. It's cheaper than ever to put photovoltaic cells on your roof. In fact, now there's companies like Solar City where you don't even have to pay out of pocket. You can just lease them. And you start realizing a benefit almost in the first month. So a lot of people are doing this. The problem is they're not paying, the utilities would argue, they're not paying their fair share to maintain the entire grid. Because maybe they're getting 80% of all the power they use from off the roof. So they're not paying any money for that 80% to the utility. The utility still needs to operate all those power lines. They need to have all those linemen out there maintaining it, maybe investing in new generation. So unless you absolutely cut the cord and go off the grid, you're still kind of dependent on it, but you're not paying your socialized share, your fair share. It's being left to everyone else who doesn't have solar, which is creating economic justice issues for, I mean, ultimately you're talking about, especially like in California, Arizona, you're talking about from a socioeconomic standpoint, the people who are least likely to have solar are the people who can't afford it, and they tend to be certain demographics, and they're getting a larger share of that socialized cost now because it's not spread out over as many people. So it's gonna happen, and it is happening to some, and it's gonna continue to happen in one way, shape, or form. But there's a lot of bigger fundamental questions of how do we make sure that we have this massive blanket of reliability that we all depend on if fewer and fewer people are paying into it. It's like if people just started stopping to pay their taxes and the federal government had to go after a shrinking number, which is kind of what has happened, a shrinking number of taxpayers. Thank you for laughing at that. It makes it their share bigger, and ultimately it's unsustainable. So I'm not sure what it's going to happen, but it's state by state. You see a lot of fights. I think, Barry, did you have something?
Yes. I had a question, Christopher. There is a bill making its way through the U.S. House of Representatives, just past the Judiciary Committee along party lines, that would put some sense into the regulatory process by requiring cost-benefit analysis and risk assessment and real science rather than anecdotal evidence before you can get to the bottom line. Do you think a bill like this has a chance of making it all the way through the House and Senate? And if so, do you have an opinion on whether the President may veto the bill because it's almost impossible to get a veto-proof majority in hand? Be curious to see what you think about that.
Yeah, we helped write it, or we suggested the way it should look before it even started, and it's passed the House now 3 times, so I'm confident it's going to pass the House again. it's important to realize that as successful as the Clean Air Act has been, there's a lot of warts on it. And one of the warts, which the Court of Appeals in DC found last year, is that EPA doesn't have to look at costs. Its only obligation is to eliminate those pollutants. So essentially what that means is they have to do it carte blanche, unlimited expense, spare no expense, I should say. Well, that's problematic because we could eliminate every pollutant we wanted. We just turn the lights off. But that's not very good for the health of the country or the economy. So one would think that there needs to be some sort of balance between our environmental goals as well as maintaining a certain lifestyle of which we as Americans have become accustomed to. Not the least of which just being able to flick the switch and know the lights are going to come on. There's actually a Supreme Court case that was heard last week whether or not EPA does have to consider that. Do they have to consider costs? Because I'm not going to. A lot of people blaspheme EPA and say, "Ooh, they're evil." They're doing. The courts have said over and over again, they're doing what Congress told them to do. So if we want to blame anyone, blame the Congress back in 1969 and 1991 when the Clean Air Act was passed. Or this one right now for not changing it, which gets to Barry's point, there is a bill that is trying to change it, that tries to say, look, guys, gals at EPA, not only do you have to take cost benefit into consideration, but all of these models you use that tell us that we're going to remove all this stuff from the air and magically we're going to create jobs doing it, which flies in the face of, Econ 101, let alone 201, 301, or 401. You have to make those models public for us, because right now we can't get access to them. They say, just trust us, we have models, but we can't share them with you because they're proprietary. Not proprietary to the US government, but the companies that put them into place and the contracts that they signed say you're not allowed to share them. Well, that makes it very difficult for anyone who wants to legitimately question what is being done to actually question it, because it's all being done in a black box. So this bill would make cost benefit a requirement. It would also ensure that EPA was completely transparent in its modeling. It'll pass the House. It might even pass the Senate. I wouldn't hold my breath. But I doubt it's going to get 60 votes in the Senate, and it certainly couldn't survive an Obama administration veto. Which brings me, I guess, to an axiom, which is in DC, there's sort of this conventional wisdom that environmental legislation can only pass under a Republican president. Because you know that anything that passes with bipartisan support is not likely to be strong enough for a Democratic president, historically, but it might be enough for, say, George Herbert Walker Bush, which was the last time that we amended the Clean Air Act, or Richard Nixon in 1969 when we first passed the Clean Air Act. So if there's a lot of good legislation out there, and environmentalists understand there's some problems here. I mean, they run into the same issues of trying to build things as traditional power. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, actually, it was not more than 50 miles from here when Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I won't give you my Austrian accent, but a solar farm was stopped in its tracks by environmentalists because they didn't like it was going to hurt a tortoise or something. But he said, if you can't build a solar farm in the Mojave Desert, then where the hell can you build it? Which is a very good rhetorical question. There are a lot of environmentalists who want to see changes too. It just takes that right political situation coming together, and hopefully in the next administration it does. Sir? When will we run out of storage? Well, if you turn on CNBC right now, that's what every single trader is betting on, when it's going to happen. I can't tell you that because we've never gotten to this point before where production just keeps going, demand doesn't pick up, and it's got to go somewhere. What will probably happen before, and we've already seen glints of this before storage actually runs out, is some people are going to just turn the valve off. They're going to leave the oil in the ground. I mean, right now we're stopping drilling for new oil, but the wells that exist are still producing. The next step is to say, all right, turn it off. Because as soon as we hit whatever that magical capacity market or top point is, then by definition, the price has to plummet. Because you have nowhere to take it. And so if you're a buyer, if you're a refiner, you're like, all right, guys, yesterday was $50 a barrel. Today, I think it's $20 a barrel. And you have no choice but to take that price because you have nowhere else to put it. Well, some people are going to start saying, well, fine, I'm just not going to sell it anymore. I mean, once the stuff's out of the ground, fine, but right now I'm turning it off. And we're starting to see a little bit of that. Some of the more independent producers who are much more nimble than some of the larger producers are starting to say, we just can't. We're willing to wait 6 months, maybe a year, in order to get a higher price per barrel. And I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the last part of your question.
Where will that point be per barrel? Is it going to be under 30?
Oh, I have no idea. It's funny because my friends who work in oil and gas trade associations, they can never even talk about price because then they must be colluding. But because we have so many members across so many sectors, we can speculate all we want. I see no way that price doesn't come down. I'll just say that. There's a lot of people who think that we've hit the bottom and that we're starting to build back up, but we're still producing, and we're producing more than we can consume globally at a faster rate, no less. So at some point, there has to be more price. There has to be further drop in price. And it will be certainly accelerated if we hit that tipping point as far as storage. And we've got to be there. It boggles my, I'm a policy guy, I'm not a markets guy, but when I sit there and I watch the data come out every Wednesday, and we see storage has increased another 4 or 5%, but the price of oil really doesn't change. Like, what are these guys thinking? What do they know that I don't know? I don't know that they know anything, but that's the hardest part for me as a policy guy to ultimately figure out, is that the price of an oil future or any commodity future isn't necessarily tied to good old-fashioned supply and demand nexus. It's based on all kinds of different algorithms that go into what people are willing to pay for it, and that's different than whether or not there's a buyer for a barrel of oil out there. So it's going to get lower, but I don't know how much lower.
Question here.
Chris, thank you for your presentation. And one quick question is, do you really believe that big...
Do you think as we get closer and closer to, say, 2025, and we start seeing natural gas get pinched, that's when people are going to say, whoa, we've already assumed that coal's getting pinched, and we've taken that into account. But we thought this gas being under attack was kind of rhetoric. But when they see it really isn't, that's when they'll be forced into it. Because at the end of the day, this is beautiful. You go to the Sierra Club website, they have Beyond Coal campaign, they have Beyond Gas campaign, they have Beyond Nuclear campaign, and they have Beyond Oil campaign. These are all campaigns to get rid of these things from the U.S. energy stream. When you ask them, how are we going to function? They say, well, renewables. 90% renewable power source by 2035. Well, so they're going to go from 4% to 90% in 20 years. I mean, that is staggering. But here's the issue that no one ever really addresses, including this administration. As they're, through these policies, they're pushing us more and more into the renewables. The Achilles heel is the intermittency of these. I mean, wind and solar are great all over the place, but the one thing that they have in common is you can't rely on them. As power consumers, as utilities, they have baseload power. They have to have a certain amount of baseload power. Baseload is something that runs 24/7, 365 days a year. And for the most part, it's coal and nuclear. It's becoming more and more natural gas, and natural gas at least has that capability. But wind and solar don't. So really the Achilles heel right now is finding storage for that. If you want to rely 90% on these things, you have to have some sort of, it's got to be better than a Tesla, because Tesla, as great as the cars might be, it's 1960s technology as far as the battery storage itself. If you want to rely on renewable for 90% of our power, you have to find a way to storage. And California is pushing the envelope right now in some of its policies, but the technology's not there yet. No one's answered that. So when no one, because they don't take them seriously, at least on this, nobody goes to Sierra Club and said, wait a second, how are we going to get to 90%? Well, they know it's preposterous, but no one's forced to explain, once you get rid of coal, once you get rid of gas, once you get rid of nuclear, once you get rid of oil, then what? I mean, Stone Age. I mean, right now, based on technology, that's kind of where we are. Because you don't have that reliability anymore. You don't have the way to store it. So ultimately, to your point about coal, I mean, you follow the markets, coal is beleaguered. Now, I will say the shining light for coal is that demand around the world is skyrocketing. Somewhere in the next year or two, it's going to overtake oil as the single largest source of energy around the world. I mean, whether it's China, all those different countries I showed you in the beginning, they're motivated by bringing large amounts of power to a large number of people at cheap prices. Because without all three of those, it doesn't make sense for them. So coal production is skyrocketing. It's just that we have the largest coal reserves in the world, and we're saying no more coal.
Well, Christopher, you just won the prize for the most questions asked of any speaker ever. And that speaks for itself. As you know, we've had a long-standing relationship with the U.S. Chamber. They've opened a lot of doors for us, one of the best things we've ever done, and you certainly opened our eyes here today. We would like to offer you a little token of our appreciation and hope you'll remember us in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you very
I
much.
appreciate it.